like a hell cut.
In geological knowledge. So in the previous 3 lectures we have discussed the classification of faults, various types of faults on the basis of their classification, that on what basis they have been classified, means on the basis of the relationship of the dip and the strike or their attitude of the beds. And today we will discuss another important classification of some faults, and this will be the last video in the sequence of the faults classification. And why I am discussing the faults classification in such detail, because it's very important for you to understand the basics, that in which environment or where they generate and what is the basic definition of those faults. Because in the competitive exams the questions are generally asked from these types of faults, okay, either on the figure basis or on the statement basis, okay. So that is the last video in the sequence of the classification of faults. So let's discuss it out. And the first question is the fault not belonging to the classification of fault with the attitude of fault as basis. Means in the first video we have discussed several bases of the classification of faults, and this question relates to the that basic video of classification of fault, the first type of video, okay. So this question asked the not belonging to the classification of faults with the attitude of the fault as basis. So that is heave fault, strike fault, dip fault of the oblique type of fault. So we all have discussed in the previous or in the first video, that is on the basis of the relationship between the strike of the fault and the attitude of strata, the faults have been classified into 4 types. Basically they are dip faults, strike faults and the oblique faults. And another one very important fault which is not included in this slide, that is the bedding fault, okay. So mutual relationship of the attitude of fault and of the disrupted rock has been used in some cases for the classifying faults into 3 or 4 types. So the remaining, that is the heave fault, that is not the basis of the classification with the attitude of fault as basis, okay. So the option A is right. Next one is faults that are developed along bedding plane. Faults which develop along the bedding planes, what are they called? So these are known as bedding fault. A bedding fault is one which occur along a contact between beds of different or the same lithologies. Means for a fault to be a bedding fault, it must occur along a contact, and that contact between the beds of the different or the same lithologies. Means the beds which are occurring, that can be of the same lithologies or there may be variation in the lithologies, okay. So the bedding faults are difficult to recognize because they are parallel to the bedding planes, okay. So sometimes the faults are developed along the bedding plane. In such cases they are aptly called as bedding fault. So option C was the right answer. Third one is the fault where fault strike is parallel to the dip of the layer, broken and disrupted by the faulting. What are those faults called as? Dip faults, strike fault, oblique fault or the head fault. So those are known as the dip fault. Dip fault means dip faults are the faults which develop parallel to the dip of the strata, or we can say in other terms, the fault strike is parallel to the dip of the layer, broken and disrupted by the faulting, okay. So option A, dip fault, is the right answer. Fourth one is the fault which is also called a diagonal fault, okay. A fault which is also called a diagonal fault What is that fault known as? Wrench fault, transform fault, oblique fault, or the dip fault? So that is the oblique fault. Okay. And how an oblique fault is developed? So oblique fault, a fault which runs oblique to the strike and dip direction of strata, are known as the oblique fault. And when a fault strikes diagonal to the dip of the regional structure, these are known as the transverse faults. Okay, so there is a minute difference between oblique fault and the transverse fault. So when the dip runs parallel to the a fault which runs oblique to the strike and dip of the strata, they are known as the oblique fault. But when a fault strikes diagonal to the dip of the regional structure, these are known as the transverse fault. Okay, so oblique faults, they are also known as the diagonal faults. In such a fault, the fault strike makes an oblique angle with the strike of the rocks in which it has caused the displacement of beds. Fifth one is the type of fault which is observed in both continental as well as the oceanic environment. Strikeslip fault, dip fault, oblique fault, or the wrench fault. So that is the strikeslip fault. And in the previous video we have also discussed the strikeslip fault, that how they are formed and other names of strikeslip fault. Okay. Strikeslip faults are the most important and widely developed fault in the crust of the earth, which have been observed both on the continental as well as the oceanic environment. Okay. So option A, that is the strikeslip fault, is the right answer. Sixth one is, which is the type of strikeslip fault in which the fault plane has developed transverse to the regional structure? Basically you have to keep in mind the direction as well as the fault plane, okay, while deciding the type of fault. Basically you have to give a very pay attention while deciding a fault to be a particular type. Means that how, in which direction the fault block has moved or the movement has taken place. Okay, so in this particular question, in which the fault plane has developed transverse to the regional structure, not along the regional structure. Okay, transverse, that is transform fault, wrench fault, translational fault, or the tear fault. So that is the wrench fault. Okay, wrench fault is also known as the tear fault. Okay, in strike slip faulting, the relative, what happens in wrench faulting? In the strike slip faulting, the relative displacement of the block is horizontal, nearly horizontal. The fault plane of a strike slip fault is more or less vertical, okay, and extends for long distances. And because of these faults frequently strike across the trend of the faults, they are sometimes called as the transcurrent or tear or the wrench type of faults. Okay. So wrench fault is a strike slip fault in origin in which the fault plane has developed transverse to the regional structure and even the net slip has taken place in the same manner. Okay, so that is known as the wrench fault. Seventh one is transverse fault, is the another name for the fault, transform fault, tear fault, wrench fault, or the normal fault. So that is the transverse fault is another name for the wrench fault. Previously we have discussed in the previous slide that the dip of the wrench fault is the very steep and that is sometimes nearly vertical. So these are also sometimes referred to as the transverse fault. Okay. Next one is, where do the transform fault occur extensively? Continental blocks, oceanic ridges, island blocks, or the volcanic ridges? So they occur in the oceanic ridges. Transform faults are strike slip faults. They occur in the oceanic ridges on the extensive scale. Okay. So transform fault, they occur in the oceanic ridges. Okay, and it's important to you remember that how in a next new video we will discuss in detail about the formation of transverse as well as the transcurrent fault, sorry, transform and the transcurrent fault at the mid-oceanic region. And it's very important for you to understand the mechanism of this faulting, that how this mechanism of these faults takes place, okay, at mid-oceanic regions. Ninth one is identify the group of small sized faults from the following: parallel faults, Enechelon faults, peripheral fault, or the radial fault. So these are basically the Enechelon fault. Okay, so these are relatively very short faults which overlap each other. Okay, so they may be defined as group of small sized faults that occur each other in the region of their occurrence. So a second fault is appearing on the surface at the distance from the first fault ends, and so on. Means the first faulting takes place and subsequently the second, third, fourth on that faulting takes place. Okay, so that give rise to the overlapping fault. Okay, it looks like that overlapping of the fault plane has taken place in Enechelon faults. So option B is right. Next one is group of faults which appear emerging outward from a common central region are known as, okay, group of faults which appear emerging outward from a common central point or central region, these are known as Enechelon fault, parallel fault, peripheral fault, or the radial fault. So these are known as the radial faults. And how they are formed? So a number of faults exhibiting a radial pattern on the ground surface, they are known as the radial faults. Okay, so they emerge outward from a common central region, and the area is divided into blocks with inwardly tapering ends. So the ends of those blocks, they taper inwards. Okay, so option D, that is the radial fault, is the correct answer. Next one is 11th one. The statement is given here: parallel fault, there is a misprinting, parallel fault can also sometimes lead to the step faults. So statement is given here and you have to observe it or pick it out whether it's right or wrong. So parallel fault can sometimes lead to the step faults. So that is the right answer, means it's true. And why I'm saying like that? So in some cases the intervening blocks are down thrown in same general direction as so that they viewed from one side. Okay, what happens that the intervening blocks are down thrown in the same general direction so that they viewed from the one side, the group gives a step like appearance in the structure. So that's why they are known as the step like faults or step faults. Okay, so option B, option A is the right answer. We have discussed in the Enechelon faults, they are relatively short faults, short type of faults which overlap each one another. Okay, so range fault is classification with the D is the right answer. So this was our discussion about the classification of various types of faults, and it's very important for you to revise and uh, go for all the 4 videos we have discussed in the classification of faults, and you can watch all the videos because it's very important for you to understand the basics behind the faulting. Okay, and in the next video we will discuss about the mechanism as well as the effect of faulting. Okay, thank you.